You can't land in darkness.
No, you can't, because you haven't got headlights on. You know, the old joke, if you're travelling at the speed of light and you turn your headlights on, what happens?
I think the light just doesn't go anywhere because it has to be the same speed.
Well, something like that. It's one of those questions that everybody asks, but nobody quite got the answer to. There's another side to this whole Apollo 13 thing. You've made a very good point that it's worked very well. Everybody was happy. They all landed successfully and they all got out and everybody cheered. It started off with a disaster and it ended up with a triumph, which is why I say, was it real? Was the whole thing completely fabricated? Because there is another story to Apollo 13, which is not often told, not often known about. So let's just cover a few of the details. We said that Apollo 13 launched on Saturday, April the 11th, 1970.
Yes.
And any Apollo craft being launched from Florida, where they were, would follow more or less an equatorial orbit, despite people claiming that it went into polar orbit. Let's say an equatorial orbit. And most of the Apollo astronauts would look out for a feature in Africa. And that feature was known as the Eye of Africa, or more correctly, the Richat structure, R-I-C-H-A-T.
Yeah.
It's a very evident physical structure in Mauritania, which looks like an eye. It's about 20 kilometers in diameter. It's large enough to be seen from space. And astronauts would watch out for it because they knew they'd be flying close to it, so they knew they'd be on the right course.
It's concentric circles. I mean, it looks artificial, quite frankly.
It's been claimed to be the site of Atlantis because it is very close to the description given by Plato for what Atlantis looked like, 3 concentric circles. And it's a very, very hard place to reach. I've only ever seen one film of anybody who's actually got to that Richat structure.
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the Sahara Desert, which is very difficult to get to, of course.
And of course, Mauritania is not exactly known for its security either. It's full of people who will attack you.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is why the famous Paris-Dakar rally had to be moved to South America, because they couldn't guarantee the security for the cars going through Mauritania.
You see this, you know you're on the right course. It's a very distinctive object. You could see it from space, but it's near the equator, which means sort of slightly north, near the tropics.
That's right.
So you'd be able to see it if you're on an equatorial course. It wouldn't be below the horizon.
It's something that the astronauts would look out for. So that is the course that most of the Apollo rockets would take. And they would watch out for this, and they would know they're on the right course. However, now we come to the other side of the story. On April the 12th, 1970, in the Bay of Biscay, which is further north from Mauritania, obviously, it's in Europe, about 400 miles off the coast of Spain, because the Bay of Biscay is bounded by France on the east side, Spain on the south. 400 miles north of Spain, there were Russian naval exercises taking place. There were a lot of Russian ships in the area. It was known that this was happening. This was not an unknown event. But one of those Russian ships recovered from the Atlantic Ocean an Apollo command module. They hoisted it on board their ship, fishing boat it was, which is a euphemism for a spy ship, and it was taken from the Bay of Biscay by a rather circuitous route up to Murmansk, which was the naval base that would operate the Soviet Navy as it was then if it was in the Atlantic, Murmansk being north of Norway on the Russian coast, next to Finland and Norway. So pretty cold. 6 months later, September the 4th, a US Coast Guard cutter called the South Wind arrived at Murmansk for a 3-day rest and recreation visit. And during its visit there, this is the first time any US Navy ship had visited Murmansk since the Second War, because America and Russia were on the same side in the Second War, if you go back that far. The US Coast Guard cutter South Wind visited Murmansk, and during its time there, it recovered the Apollo command module, which the Soviet Navy had brought back with them. because the law says that any nation recovering a space artifact belonging to another nation should hand it back. So that's what the Soviet Union were doing. They were handing it back to America. That command module was taken from Murmansk on the South Wind, and there are photographs of it on there. This is not some folklore story. This is a real event.
There's a large number of images, both from the Russians and the Americans. Some they're posing, the Russians and Americans together with this, what looks like an Apollo command module. Was this just after the launch, just before?
Just after. The official launch of Apollo 13 was on April the 11th. This command module was recovered by the Soviet Navy the next day.
That's weird. I mean, it's not like it's a secret. There's photographs here. You can see like there's Coast Guard sailors smiling and standing, in front of this ice-covered thing which says NASA on it. It's a command module. It says NASA actually written on it.
Yeah, photograph of it on the front deck of the USS Coast Guard cutter South Wind. It's indisputably a command module. Now, the official explanation is that, no, this isn't an official command module. This is a boilerplate module. And its official title is BP Boilerplate 1227.
Boilerplate, so what does that mean?
Basically, a boilerplate was used for practice. They would put the astronauts in it, drop them from a fairly low height into the water, and they would practice getting out. So it was used for practice activity.
They'd be in there, but the material wouldn't be like a command module. Just they could practice the re-entry and the getting out and things like that.
So that's what it has been described as. But the next question is, what the hell was it doing in the Bay of Biscay in the first place?
What was any Apollo craft, any NASA spacecraft doing floating in the Bay of Biscay? That's really weird, isn't it?
It gets weirder because this boilerplate, which is presumably a sort of practice thing, it's built to look like an Apollo command module, like it probably is. And that's its purpose. The astronauts would practice in it, getting into it, getting out of it, because they would be parachuted back into the Pacific. So they had to practice getting out of their command module into the rubber dinghies that were brought to take them to the rescue ships. But this command module, recovered from the Bay of Biscay, had not been reported as missing. You'd think that they'd notice, even if it was a practice command module. You'd think they'd say, hey, it fell overboard and it drifted away, we couldn't catch it. Anybody see it? Let us have it back, please. No, there was no announcement about that. Nothing at all. And Florida is at least 2,000 miles from the Bay of Biscay. And if it were to drift with the prevailing winds, which it could do, it would take quite a while to do it, 3, 4, 5 weeks maybe, and it would then show signs of growth on it, because if you put any object in the sea for any length of time, it's going to get seaweed and barnacles attached to it.
Yeah.
And it was fortunate that it was all shut up as well. I mean, there were no doors open, there were no windows open, so because if there had been, it would almost certainly have sunk.
I'd imagine that it wouldn't be like as tightly sealed as a real spacecraft. I think it would probably have sunk anyway. I mean, you know what happens to boats on the river in Oxford? Someone has to go in there every couple of weeks and just pump out the bilges. If you leave a boat alone for like a couple of months, it will sink. And the same goes for big ships. The water has to be pumped out of them regularly.
Yeah. So Apollo command modules, the same thing would apply. If it's been floating around in the Atlantic for 3 or 4 weeks or even a bit longer, when nobody's missed it, nobody's known that it's gone missing and sort of drifting across the Atlantic, you'd think on the photographs that we're seeing, that you've seen there and which are quite easily available, there's no algae, there's no growth marks on it. So what is it doing there? Was it, as we're told, the boilerplate 1227, or was it actually the command module for Apollo 13?
Obviously, another factor is, of course, for it actually to be captured like that, you'd have to be very, very lucky. If you lost something and it floated across the Atlantic, which is only like 18 feet across, I mean, it's the size of a small boat, yeah, they found it in the middle of the ocean. That's like more than finding a needle in a haystack.
It's finding a capsule in the Atlantic. It doesn't make logical sense. If you look at it from a critical thinking viewpoint, you say, okay, well, let's have a look at this. Let's say it's the boilerplate thing. Let's say it's what it's claimed to be. How did it get there? Why is there no growth on it to show it's been in the water for several weeks? How did the Russians find it, not the Americans? You'd think if the Americans had missed it, they might have gone chasing after it said, okay, guys, watch out for it. It's this high, this wide. If you find it, give it back to us, please. No, the Russians found it. The Americans didn't ask for it back. There were no American ships anywhere near it at the time. There was a Soviet naval exercise going on. Right, let's take it next step further. Supposing the Russians, they'd obviously been following Apollo. They knew where the launch trajectory was going to go, and they were just hoping for a lucky break and that maybe something would go wrong and they could get there first and recover what fell out.
Standard intelligence gathering.
Yes, intelligence gathering mission. They would have ships around. I mentioned the fishing boat onto which it was loaded and returned to Russia. That was a spy ship, because there were plenty of them around. Now, if the Russians just got lucky and happened to pass across this command module, the implication being that it was actually Apollo 13, it was the official Apollo 13, which aborted. But it's not in the right place. If it was on its proper trajectory, it's about 1,500 miles north of where it should have been. Could it be that it aborted because it went off course?
Does this mean then they came up with the idea of the accident in space afterwards, or was the accident in space planned originally?
Well, if they had an accident in space, they would then avoid having to do all the prancing around on the moon. So they could just ramp up the Jeopardy action, which they did rather successfully. Because don't forget that America is very good at publicity.
That's true, yeah.
So they would ramp up the idea of the brave astronauts. But supposing they knew perfectly well, somebody knew perfectly well, that the astronauts were in no physical danger because they were back here on Earth, and they were going to be flown across America and put up into a C-130 transport plane, put into another command module and jumped out the back of it so they could be seen to parachute down. It wouldn't be difficult to organize that. That, ironically, is the storyline behind the film Capricorn 1.
But the astronauts would have been inside this command module when it landed in the Bay of Biscay. Do you think there were actually astronauts on board?
Well, it's 50-50. Were there astronauts on board? All of the Apollo craft.
Or were they taken out like in Capricorn 1?
Were they, yes, taken out. And there was a means to take them out as well. At the top of the 39A launch tower at Cape Canaveral, as it was then, there was a means of rapid exit from the command module. It was a tube down which you would slide, like a giant fairground slide, and you'd land up in a room below the launch tower, which was soundproofed and protected. Assuming that the rocket then exploded or took off, you would be protected from it. Now, this room existed. Anybody who's followed it closely will have seen the film of James Burke actually coming down the slide and coming into the security room below the launch pad. Now, I don't know, because I don't have any evidence that it happened, but if you look at it from a point of view of probabilities, could an astronaut have gone up as if to get onto the command module, not got into the command module, come down the escape chute, where nobody would have seen them because it would be just before the launch, be able to be secreted away 24 hours later when all the interest in what was going on because the rocket had gone, and gone elsewhere. All right, it gets into the realm of fantasy and science fiction at this point, but these are things which are possible. It's not to say that they're an impossible scenario, because this command module was certainly recovered from the Bay of Biscay. You've got the photographs there, you've seen what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's the size of a command module, Apollo command module.
Yeah. I don't think it's possible to resolve this, but obviously this is suspicious. There's an odd coincidence that these things happened at the same time.
And when coincidences become mathematically impossible, because you've got to have so many stacked up one on top of the other, you then start looking for other explanations.
Yeah.
I mentioned that this command module, which was recovered from the Atlantic by the Russians, is on display, and you can go and see it today. It's at Grand Rapids in Michigan. It's on display outside. There's one problem, though. You can't see inside it. It's sealed until 2076.
Oh, that's a long time to wait. So it's like a little time capsule.
Yes, so we don't know whether it is the real command module, because the official display of the Apollo 13 command module is in Kansas.
I'm not recommending this, by the way, listeners, but I'd be sorely tempted to see if I could sneak in after closing time and just take a little peek.
An interesting exercise, because then you could measure the one thing that nobody's actually got the answer to yet: the diameter of the tunnel through which astronauts had to move between the command module when they got into the lunar lander. It appears to be too small to move an astronaut wearing a spacesuit, which means that he got into his spacesuit inside the lunar lander. How did he do it? Any film of an astronaut being kitted out in his spacesuit, it takes two other assistants to help him into it.
Or when James Burke put one on, who in the documentary he did about Apollo, it took two of them to get it off him. But I mean, I suppose the point I want to make is that if you sneak in and take a look when no one's watching, and you see what you see inside is actually a real command module, not a boilerplate one, I don't know how they'd explain that. They probably said, oh, we did use a real one instead of the boilerplate or something like that. They'd come up with some explanation, I'm sure. They would retcon it like they've done everything else with the radiation and stuff.
Of course they would. There are answers to everything, which is why it's a fairly frustrating experience examining all these anomalies. And there are so many anomalies on the Apollo program. Once you start getting into them, it's almost endless. There's always a counter argument. And it's, oh, no, obviously you don't understand about this, you don't understand about that. No, actually I do understand about a great deal of this. And just to go back to some of the things we were discussing earlier, not today, but earlier in the Apollo Detective series, talking about the effect of a hard vacuum on photographic film.
Oh, that's a new piece of research that you've done. So tell the listeners about that.
Photographic film cannot survive in a hard vacuum, i.e. the level of vacuum that exists certainly on the lunar surface and usually around the International Space Station. Photographic film, I'm not talking about digital here, I'm talking about photographic film. That was what was used to take all the photographs we've seen of the Apollo missions. Photographic film, used in the Hasselblad cameras, still cameras, and the Mara data acquisition cameras mounted inside the lunar lander to photograph the astronauts allegedly prancing around on the lunar surface. Photographic film is made of a plastic backing coated with light-sensitive emulsion, i.e. the chemical. If that is in a vacuum, the emulsion will outgas. Now, in very simple terms, that means that the vacuum is so powerful, it will suck out from the chemical on the emulsion, initially the lighter elements, the hydrogens. Basically, it will destroy the film, and you cannot record using photographic film in a vacuum. So how do you get around this? Because there were two spacecraft. One was the Lunar Orbiter, not to be confused with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. The Lunar Orbiter was launched to photograph potential landing sites for Apollo in 1966. And the other one was the Hexagon Spy satellite, launched in 1971. Both of those two craft used photographic film to record the images. And in order to ensure the survival of the photographic film, they were housed within a pressurized container inside the spacecraft. It's shown on the schematics of the Lunar Orbiter. You can see where the hydrogen canister, which provides the pressurization, is, and the extent of the airtight container in which the film is kept. The Hexagon Spy satellite, which is quite a lot bigger, 60 foot long, had a pressurized container, 30 miles of photographic film that was contained in it, 155,000 feet of film, and the camera and the buckets on which the film was dropped from the spacecraft to be caught by a fishing net being trailed behind an aircraft. Absolutely true. So photographic film has to be kept in a pressurized environment. Not a very big pressure, about 1 pound per square inch will do, but it must be pressurized. So how do I know all this? Because I attended a lecture in London 2 years ago where the designer of the Hexagon Spy satellite camera system, it was a stereo camera, very, very sophisticated, credible piece of equipment. The designer of that camera equipment had now been released from the oaths of secrecy, and the Hexagon Spy satellite had been declassified. And he said it. He said the film had to be kept pressurized. End of story. And I actually asked him a question. I said, would this apply to Apollo? Of course it would, he said. Film doesn't work in a vacuum. It has to be pressurized.
You've actually proved this with an experiment, haven't you?
We have, yes. Over in Canada with Scott Henderson and his mate Bob Williams. Bob went out and bought a vacuum chamber, commercial vacuum chamber, and bought the film similar to, if not identical to, the film used on Apollo, the Estar-based Kodak Ektachrome film, and did various tests with it. It's well known that Apollo 17, there were 3 EVAs, so the astronauts would get out of the lunar lander, walk around, take photographs, get back in, repressurize the lunar lander. A few hours later, they'd go through the same rigmarole again. They did it 3 times. It's a 3 times pressurization, depressurization. And Bob Williams recreated that over a 72-hour period, 3 days. And the film was damaged. He had a control film, which he took photographs of, and he then took the film that was in the vacuum chamber, put it in the camera, and took an identical subject matter and developed both films as per instruction. And you can see very clearly that the color balance of the film that was taken from the vacuum chamber is completely shot. It doesn't record the colors which the control film will show. The blue of the sky, green of the grass, all the color balance is gone.
And there's an article on the Owless website called Apollo Film Subjected to a Vacuum. There's a distinct difference in quality. The ones with the vacuum on the right of this column, you can see the colours almost drained out of it.
You can.
On the one on the left, which is just a normal film, it's the colours all there, it's normal. But on the one on the right, taking pictures of the same things,
Yep.
colours gone. It's like, but of course, if you look at the Apollo record, the films are perfect. They're perfectly fine.
Yes.
But,
Yeah.
they look great. I mean, they were on the front cover of Time. They're some of the most famous photographs ever taken.
Yes. Well, most of them are colour images. Well, certainly the ones we see reproduced in magazines are the colour images. And the colours are what you'd expect them to be. The American flag, which is red, white, and blue as well. All the colours on the American flag, which appears in quite a few of the pictures, are perfectly normal. It's what you'd expect. The vacuum on the lunar surface is severe. We're talking hard vacuum. It's a harder vacuum than can ever be reproduced here on Earth.
Yeah, Scott has proved actually that in his own work that it's considerably harder, the vacuum, than the one which is in low Earth orbit where the International Space Station is. And you see people wearing spacesuits there, but on the moon, no atmosphere. It's like the very thin, tenuous upper atmosphere of the Earth is absent.
Exactly, because there are no particles of atmosphere. Oxygen, hydrogen, whatever, nitrogen. There's nothing there, so there's nothing there. This is what I mean by vacuum. And the other thing, I mentioned outgassing. Anybody who's done a little physics experiment and has got a bell jar which can have its air evacuated will know if you put a bowl of water inside a vacuum, it'll start to boil. That's outgassing. It's the gases within the water being forced out. Now, the other thing that happens in extreme vacuums is what's called cold welding. It's what the name implies. You get 2 metals touching in a hard vacuum. They will literally weld each other together, or they will be welded. And there's no physical intervention. What is happening is that the vacuum will force out the volatile elements from the metals, the hydrogen and so on. And as it's being forced out, they will intermingle with each other if the metals are close together. And it will be as if they had welded together.
So this is a kind of outgassing from metal.
Yeah, metals outgas just as much as liquids do. Now, if you've got metals outgassing and you've got a photographic camera with a metal shutter, which the Hasselblad cameras have, in a vacuum, you would expect the shutter leaves, there are 6 of them, will start to weld together, but they don't. You'd expect the spacesuit, which in a vacuum, you can't just have a little rubber seal between the helmet and the spacesuit. You have to have metal seals, but they would cold weld together.
The cold welding effect would happen to the spacecraft. It would inevitably cause it to malfunction.
Yes. Now, obviously, there are ways in which you can prevent that, because spacecraft have been sent to the moon regularly. The first one was 1959 when the Russians did it. The Chinese have done it, the Indians have done it, the Japanese have done it, the Russians have done it, the Americans have done it. So unmanned spacecraft can be protected. There are things that you could do. Basically, it's putting on a form of Teflon coating onto the metal so it doesn't outgas. Ironically, Teflon will outgas itself, but it will protect the metal underneath it. So there are spacecraft in this hard vacuum, but they're all unmanned. This is the difference. These are spacecraft designed specifically for the conditions. Now, I went on a tour of a company near Guildford that makes satellites. And I asked them, I said, what precautions do you take against vacuum in space? And they said, well, we've got a test chamber, and we know what we have to do to protect the metals. We know what we have to do to protect the electronics from radiation in space. And it's basically called hardening. And they're using forms of insulation. Gold foil is quite a good form of insulation, but they use lead and uranium, which are very solid metals. But these are unmanned spacecraft, and they can be designed and constructed in such a way that they can survive the dangers and the problems of space. But when you start putting humans into space, that is where you get the real problem. Because us humans, we're very delicate little creatures.
Oh, yeah.
We have to take our pressurized atmosphere with us. We have to take all our food and drink with us, and we have to be able to get rid of the excrement that we might produce. So they have large nappies.
Yeah.
So humans have to be protected in ways which are yet to be discovered.